They laughed when an old man arrived at the family barbecue in a rusty pickup truck. His own family forced him to sit alone in the backyard because they were embarrassed by him. But just minutes later, black SUVs surrounded the house. The mayor walked straight past everyone and saluted the old man. What happened next exposed a family secret that had been buried for 37 years and left the entire neighborhood in shock. They kicked my grandpa out of the family barbecue until the mayor arrived. My name is Henry Walker. I am 74 years old. I live alone in a small town in Texas. My grandson invited me to our annual family barbecue. I was happy because it had been months since I had seen everyone. I washed my old blue pickup truck. I put on my cleanest shirt. Before leaving, I picked up homemade peach pie because it was my granddaughter's favorite. When I arrived, everyone was laughing, talking, and taking family pictures. I smiled and walked toward them. But my daughter-in-law looked at my old truck, then at my clothes. She frowned. She quietly said, "Please stay in the backyard. We do not want the guests to think you are with us." My heart broke. Nobody defended me. I carried the pie to the backyard and sat alone on an old wooden chair. I watched my own family celebrate without me. Just then, several black SUVs stopped outside the house. Police officers stepped out. A black car pulled in behind them. The mayor walked straight toward me. He smiled, shook my hand, and said, "Mr. Henry Walker, it is an honor to finally meet the man who saved my father's life during the flood of 1989. The entire backyard went silent. Everyone stared at me. The mayor turned to the guests and said, "This man is a true American hero. Without him, my family would not be here today." Then he handed me the city's highest civilian honor. My daughter-in-law burst into tears. My grandson lowered his head in shame. For the first time that day, everyone stood up for me. But I had already learned who truly respected me. The backyard stayed completely silent. No one knew what to say. My grandson slowly walked toward me. Tears filled his eyes. "Grandpa, I am so sorry. I should have stood beside you." I looked at him and smiled. "I was never angry with you. I was only disappointed that respect disappeared so easily." The mayor then asked everyone to gather around. He shared the full story. 37 years earlier, a powerful flood had swept through our town. His father had been trapped inside a truck surrounded by rising water. People were too afraid to help. I tied a rope around my waist and jumped into the flood. After several minutes, I pulled him to safety. I never asked for money. I never asked for recognition. Everyone began clapping. I simply went back to work the next morning. The mayor looked at the crowd and said, "Heroes do not always wear expensive suits. Sometimes they drive old pickup trucks." Even the neighbors who had been watching from outside joined in. For the first time in years, I felt truly seen. But I still had one final decision to make. Everyone expected me to forgive them immediately. My daughter-in-law walked over with tears in her eyes. She asked me to come back inside and join the family table. My grandson held my hand and said, "Grandpa, please give us another chance." I looked at all of them for a long moment. Then I quietly said, "Respect should never begin after someone becomes famous. It should exist from the very beginning." No one could look me in the eyes. The mayor nodded and said, "Mr. Henry Walker is right. A person's value is measured by their character, not by their clothes, their car, or their money." My granddaughter hugged me tightly. She whispered, "Grandpa, I will never be ashamed of you again." I smiled and handed her the homemade peach pie I had brought. This time the whole family sat together. No one asked me to stay in the backyard. For the first time, I was given the seat at the head of the table. As the sun went down, I realized something. The greatest victory was not making people feel guilty. It was teaching them a lesson they would never forget. The respect I received that evening lasted far longer than any award. The next morning, my phone would not stop ringing. I almost never received calls. But that day, dozens of people wanted to speak with me. Neighbors thanked me. Old friends I had not seen for years called to say they were proud of me. Then a local news reporter knocked on my front door. She asked if she could hear my story. I invited her inside. My house was small. The furniture was old. The walls held faded photographs from a lifetime of memories. She picked up one picture and asked, "Is this from the flood?" I smiled and nodded. That photograph had never been shown to anyone outside my family. A few hours later, the interview aired across Texas. People were shocked. Thousands of comments appeared online. Everyone asked the same question. How could a family treat a real hero this way? That evening, my grandson came to my house alone. He stood quietly on the porch holding a small wooden box. When I opened the door, he lowered his head. "Grandpa, I found this in our attic. It belongs to you." I opened the box. Inside were my old rescue medal, my military badge, and a newspaper from 1989. With my picture on the front page. Someone had hidden them away years ago. My grandson looked at me with tears in his eyes. "Grandpa, I promise I will learn the truth about everything." I placed my hand on his shoulder. But neither of us knew. The biggest family secret had still not been revealed. I looked at the old newspaper for a long time. It brought back memories I had tried to forget. My grandson sat quietly beside me. Then he asked the question no one in the family had ever asked. "Grandpa, why did you never tell us any of this?" I smiled and said, "Because real kindness does not ask for applause." I never wanted medals to define who I was. A few days later, the mayor invited me to City Hall. When I arrived, reporters and television cameras were already waiting. To my surprise, the entire city council stood and applauded. The mayor stepped to the microphone. "Today we are correcting a mistake. For more than 3 decades, Henry Walker lived as a humble neighbor while carrying the courage that saved many lives." He then announced that a new community scholarship for local students would be named after me. The audience stood and clapped. I looked across the room. My family was sitting in the front row. Every one of them had tears in their eyes. But just before the ceremony ended, an elderly woman walked toward the stage. She looked at me and whispered, "Henry I have been searching for you for 37 years. Everything that happened after the flood was not an accident. I know who stole the credit that belonged to you." The room fell completely silent. The entire room turned toward the elderly woman. She slowly walked onto the stage. Her hands were shaking. "My name is Margaret Collins. 37 years ago I worked at the county newspaper. I was the young reporter who covered the Great Flood." She opened an old folder she had carried for years. Inside were original photographs, handwritten notes, and official rescue reports. Every document carried my name. Margaret looked at the audience and said, "Henry Walker saved 7 people that day. But a wealthy businessman paid to remove his name from the story because he wanted the public to believe he was the hero." The room fell silent. Reporters immediately began taking photos of the documents. The mayor examined every page. Then he looked at me and said, "Mr. Walker, your name was stolen. But today the truth belongs to you again." Within hours, the story spread across America. Television stations called it one of the biggest forgotten hero stories in Texas history. That evening, my family came to my house together. No excuses. No arguments. Only tears. My daughter-in-law placed the old family photo back on my table and quietly said, "We judged you without ever knowing who you really were." I looked at everyone and smiled. The past could never be changed. But the future still could. Then another black SUV stopped outside my house. A man stepped out carrying a sealed envelope. He smiled and said, "Mr. Walker, Washington has been looking for you." I looked at the man standing at my front door. He introduced himself. "My name is David Ross. I work for the Department of Homeland Security." He handed me the sealed envelope. Inside was an official letter. I read the first line and froze. Mr. Henry Walker, the President of the United States, requests your presence at a special ceremony in Washington, D.C. For a moment I could not speak. My grandson smiled through his tears. Grandpa, you finally received the respect you always deserved. A week later we arrived in Washington. The ceremony was held in a beautiful historic building. Military veterans, firefighters, police officers, and rescue workers filled the hall. The announcer called my name. I slowly walked onto the stage. The entire audience stood and applauded. The president shook my hand and said, "America is stronger because of people like you. You never asked for recognition. You only chose to help others." A medal was placed around my neck. I looked into the crowd. My family was crying. Not because I had received an award, but because they finally understood the kind of man I had always been. As we left the ceremony, my granddaughter held my hand and whispered, "Grandpa, this is the proudest day of my life." I smiled and looked up at the sky. Sometimes respect arrives late. But when it comes with truth, it lasts forever. The end.